AAPI Heritage Month, though I got the notice that we're recording. Okay. I have to give props to Marion, our member Marion Ewan, for this. Marion helps so much with helping me and encouraging me to help get this panel organized. And then I want to thank the two people participating today, because this is really meant to celebrate your leadership. And we really are, our group, even though it's a grassroots organizing group, our group is also just very focused on elevating voices in our community. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Yuck and Tazin Azad. Both of you come at personal recommendations of members of our group. Yuck, Julio and Marion hold you in high regard and wanted to make sure that you were part of this. Tazin, I know that you work with Jess on the Community Education Council, and that you've been a PTA president. I don't know if you're currently a PTA co-president, but I know you've been. And so this is very exciting because Yuck works in the health space, and Tazin, you're very active in the education space and language justice space. And I feel like the two issues, health and education, are actually issues that this group has consistently been advocating, health equity, education equity. These are issues that our group has consistently advocated for, and especially with the New York Health Act, and how members of our group have had personal struggles dealing with the healthcare system, dealing with insurance companies. I'm just really excited personally to have you here, Yuck. And with the races coming up, I'm really excited to hear your opinion, Tazin, if you want to speak on, who you think, if you want to recommend anyone, who you think, whose platforms or who you have confidence in to represent the school, the student body and the parents in the school system. So I had a few questions prepared, but as you all know, our group is very informal, and I think that's the way to go because we're a very friendly group, and there's not going to be any interrogation or interviewing here. We just really want to get to know you all and use this space as like just a friendly introduction to know our neighbors, right? So we're all in Southern Brooklyn. I would like to start with self-introductions. Please introduce yourself. Let us know what you're working on in any capacity, what you care about, and how, what your leadership role is, because I have an idea, but I would really love to know how you see yourself as a leader in the community. We'll start with Yuck, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rosa, and thank you so much, everybody, for having me here. It's really great to see some familiar faces. So my name is Yuck. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief of Staff at the Academy of Medical and Public Health Services in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And I'm also the co-founder of the organization. And, I first started getting involved in this work when I was 14. At that time, that was really shortly after my father had contracted cancer and passed away. And I just remember very vividly from that experience that our family suffered so much from the lack of resources in the healthcare system. My mother was unemployed for a very long time, taking care of my father. And I was also expected to be the prime translator in my teenage years, due to the lack of language access in our hospital systems. And that's when I really began to get interested in just having a leadership role in the community where I would be able to tackle these immigrant rights, immigrant justice issues in the healthcare system, to make sure that our healthcare system is equitable for all immigrant populations, for all individuals. So fast forward a couple of years, when I was 19, I founded AMPS, Academy of Medical and Public Health Services. And, I was with the organization through my bachelor's degree, through my master's degree. And, now where we've really grown to become a safe space in the Sunset Park neighborhood, providing equitable healthcare services for our immigrant populations. My vision is to ensure that we can build a system that sees healthcare not as a privilege, but as a basic human right, especially when our current government systems create barriers to care that exclude certain populations because of where they were born or because of their income status. And that's not right. So, my work has centered around providing direct health services. Pre-pandemic, we would offer free screenings and consultations to community members that are not means tested. So anybody can basically walk into the doors. We currently provide free bilingual mental health therapy services. We have social services, education programs in adult literacy, health literacy, everything free of charge. I'm constantly advocating for policies like the New York Health Act and Coverage for All to be passed in our government systems, because I think that's what we all deserve. That's why I'm here in this room to really share all this with you, and hope that and to learn more about how you guys are also involved in this fight together.
Thank you so much, Yuck. That is an amazingly concise introduction, given like all that you've accomplished. And I'm personally just floored that you started this organization at age 19. Wow. But, but also sort of not surprised, because it must be so rewarding, given like your experiences with your family and that struggle. And it must be so rewarding to use that experience to give back to an entire community. So that's absolutely amazing. Tazin, I'm so glad you're here. I would love to hear from you, your introduction, and please let us know, your story briefly, but what is it you're fighting for? What is it you care about? And tell us what you've been up to in this crazy pandemic school year.
Oh, crazy pandemic school year, of course. Thank you so much for having me here and giving the opportunity, or considering my story important enough to share. Yuck is a hard act to follow. I'm not gonna try to. I'm just gonna share who I am. My name is Tazin Azad, she, her pronouns. I'm coming from the land of the Lenape folks. And I'm super blessed to be in the spaces of the ancestors upon whom we stand today. And so, my work my journey into parent advocacy world really began very suddenly. With the realization that as an immigrant student coming to America, my experiences was almost identical to the experiences of my children who were American born at this point, right? And this is something that when the realization came, it was just so burdensome to hold. And then simultaneously at that point, my school, located in this community that is so diverse, so global majority in community in its description, really didn't reflect the student population or the community that it was standing in representation, as far as classroom goes, in representation as far as parent leadership goes, in teaching staff goes, anywhere really. And we happen to be a really robust community just outside of the school's community, right? And then of course, what that meant was disenfranchisement of folks that are almost always are marginalized. And so like really when we were trying to really understand why this is, that despite being the majority, of a language learner community, despite being a majority community of color, why is it that we really didn't feel included in that school? And then one of the things that we identified was the language barrier. which happened to be one of the foremost barriers, but not the only one. And so this basically catapulted me into the world of, advocating for equity in education, and which sort of like led us into sort of strategizing and proposing ways of engagements with parents, because for sure we must understand that schools are the basic level of democracy. This is where parents, students, and teachers and administrators are coming together to deliberate on how a certain institution should be run. And if representation is not happening there correctly, there will be inequities. And so it really became apparent that if I was to sort of prevent the status quo and prevent folks from reliving what I have lived generations before, and my children experienced the same thing, we had to disrupt that. We had to address the inequity that were there. And then my sort of direction was language access and uplifting language learner communities, multilingual communities, and then centering that movement around Black and Brown people of colors sort of needs and demands. Did I answer all the questions? I don't know. I spoke.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's so amazing. You gave us a lot of context to what your passions are, and certainly understandable. It's certainly understandable to see the need for everything you just mentioned. I just wanted to make this I'm really resonating with a lot of what both of you are saying. So I'll be a little more personable instead of like the moderator sitting over here. But I wanted to draw connections between what you both said. And I didn't introduce myself, so also let me do that. So I'm part of South Central Brooklyn United for Progress. I've been with the group actively, consistently since about 2019. I came to New York in 2002. I'm a Pacific Islander. I'm an Indigenous person from the island of Guam, which is a military colony of the US. I learned English. I grew up learning English. I mean, I grew up speaking English. English is not my second language. Interestingly, as an Indigenous person, holding on to our native language is this other struggle, So that's my privilege in coming to New York and navigating New York, right? Is that I didn't have to, I didn't have that barrier to access. But you both come from these, you're both, fighting in the arena of institutions, right? And these are institutions that have been rooted in so much, racism, structural racism and stuff. So it's interesting that language access is, a consistent theme in what you're both fighting for. So what I wanted to ask, one question I wanted to ask is, because this panel is about resiliency, like how, what is, whether you want to make it about the past year in this pandemic or even just overall in your life, experience, having to navigate these spaces, how has your own, your identity or your culture or your own language or your own, your own personal experiences, like how has that served how has that served your leadership role, but also like how's it served, the resilience of the communities you serve, right? So not necessarily even the community that you identify with, but in Brooklyn, because we come from these we actually serve spaces that are multicultural, multi-language, how do you see, your own culture helping yourself as a leader? For myself, like just to give an example, right? Like for myself, like my culture is so oriented towards elders, and being in America, especially with the pandemic, I was immediately struck by how, people in the nursing homes were among the most vulnerable and the most directly impacted. So that's what really struck me, is that like, wow, I come from a culture where like elders are, so much embedded into our community. Like we live with our elders, we live in multi-generational, homes. So that was one of the questions I wrote in advance, is to sort of wonder, like, what, was there something that struck you that way, or is there something that you relied on, to get you through these challenges? Whoever wants to go first, I don't want to pick either one, but yeah, if that question resonates with you, please feel free to speak on that.
I'll start. So I think something that really struck me during the pandemic was the realization that there are not enough leaders of color. There are not enough leaders of color in office. There are not enough leaders of color in senior leadership position that are making culturally and linguistically appropriate decisions for our communities. And I saw this really blatantly when the city, set up a vaccination site in Sunset Park. And I remember very vividly in February when the vaccination site launched, people struggled with accessing the system because of, not only because of lack of language access through technological, appointment making platforms, but also on the site, at the site itself. There were a lack of interpreters. Signage was not translated into different languages. And people were being turned away at the door simply because they couldn't find their name in the system. And part of this comes from lack of cultural competency, right? So what I realized was that there were some people who had Asian, in the Chinese culture, a Chinese name has 2 syllables. Sometimes it has a space in between. Sometimes people enter that and people don't really realize that this is how the name is written. And we saw a lot of that, and people were essentially turned away because the people at the door did not know how to react to people who had different names on their IDs. And when you create, and this sounds really simple, but when you create systems without a culturally appropriate lens, you create systems of isolation. I had one community member who essentially on the first day that site opened, waited 2 hours in line to get to the front of the line, to then realize that they could not find him on the list because of this cultural difference. He waited 2 hours again at the site to be seen, only to not be seen. He was set aside, was not provided interpretation services, and then eventually left and told me that he didn't want to get a vaccine anymore. That is the type of institutional racism, that we see in healthcare when we don't have the appropriate representation that are making these types of decisions, however small, that would make a difference in the people that we're serving. So, that was something that I realized very early on. And, throughout this entire process, throughout the entire pandemic, we've seen that reoccur again and again in our healthcare systems. I had community members, who, in March of last year went to a public hospital, and their reception did not have anybody who spoke their language, and they were immediately, they were turned away because they didn't understand what was happening. And that individual actually had COVID at that time. We have community members, who have stood on food lines to receive food boxes, but then realized it was essentially food that they didn't know how to cook because, the people at the top who were making those decisions did not think about the ways that we experience food in our culture. And that contributes to an enhanced food insecurity in our communities, enhanced lack of healthcare access. And these are the exact barriers that we're trying to challenge every single day. But there needs to be people in leadership who represent us and who look like us.
Yeah, I'll just quickly grab into those last 2 sentences. And I want to sort of point out to folks that the things that I'm going to also speak is going to overlap with whatever Yuck has been talking about, because the issues of any communities that are marginalized, just not one issues. We don't have the luxury to be a one issue sort of community. There's pervasive lack of awareness in through all of our systems, and they're all intertwined. And so, like, I'll speak to I'll begin in the context of education and where we're working and my work. So immediately when the pandemic happened, after a few weeks, the school shut down, essentially shutting down the entire city. Right away, all multilingual communities, communities of color, communities who were digitally disconnected were completely left in the blind, right? We had no folks, DOE had a Department of Education, or even the city, for that matter, had no way of contacting these communities, and were and found themselves completely unprepared for to really even do meaningful outreach. We saw all of those translated stuff on buses, on the TV and everywhere else, but it really didn't mean anything. Really quickly, I'll say, so the translation for the word of mask that they were using for the city means sort of like a covering in what they were using. The truth is that we in Bangladeshi community know that word mask as mask. You would have known that had you had representation on your city level, on these agency levels, that how do you folks speak, and how should we speak to you? How should we reach out to you if indeed our purpose is to have you guys communicate back to us, right? And so sending out bunches of surveys asking students and families how they want to go on learning amid a pandemic were not language accessible, right? So not only that they were language accessible, the contents were so vague and so untranslatable into the languages that they were going out in, because of course New York City doesn't have the 9 languages that DOE is calling its official languages. There are myriads of other languages and dialects that's in this in the city, and more often than not is those low incident languages are the communities that need most support, and then they also happen to live together in an enclave. So if one person is not getting information, it's more than likely that most of them aren't. And so really quickly, we saw that in the schools that I worked in a program called Language Liaisons, where we build relationship with the communities of in specific languages, and sort of uplifted and empowered parent leaders who were connecting with sort of these families outside of schools. When schools weren't able to contact with families, these structures, that these ad hoc structures that we had running in the side, were able to organize and connect right away, so to speak. And not only that, we weren't connecting on the traditional ways. So of course, everybody was thinking about how do we, send, do we call folks? Do we Zoom, or do we all of that stuff? No, folks are meeting in WhatsApp, right? So what's wrong with WhatsApp? If that is something that's working, then what's wrong with it? So in our community, the resiliency piece of it, I'll say, the Bangladeshi community here is it's very dense, and it's very, and they're very interdependent. So we have not only needs in schools as far as translating work and things like that, and sort of pointing each other to where we also started a Bangla specific mutual aid, where we share. In the beginning, we know lots of information was coming in only in English, so we had to be able to translate it or direct folks in places where they were getting translated. This is not only education, it's across the board. But then also what happened to all of those ethnic grocery stores that were really reliant on the foot traffics of these enclaves for them to do businesses. So once they were shut down, their livelihood were at a point of detriment. So we sort of translated those groceries into online virtual groceries on WhatsApp. People were buying, groceries, owners were sending pictures of their products, and people were buying that from their home. And then also, not to mention really quickly, our parent advocates started, food pantries, giving away, doing home deliveries. And then another piece that I'll really quickly say is that amid all of this, I think DOE and the city had decided to make food accessible to everybody, all New Yorkers, through the schools, through school foods. But and it was, I remember, during the time of Ramadan, and we happened to find out that none of these food that they were sharing were actually adhering to halal dietary needs, nor were they kosher dietary needs either, meeting those standards. And then when they did say that these were, halal food, it just happened to be hummus and crackers. So at Ramadan, when we're breaking fast, can you imagine folks breaking their fast after the whole day with their family with that, right? And so that piece really, and what had happened, and this is not just within the schools, right? The food that folks were, the city was sending to seniors were basically prepackaged military foods labeled halal, and what was in it, we have no idea, right? And so the resiliency part of in that piece was that once we connected these dots within our own language groups, WhatsApp or whatever have you, because we were resilient, we were able to connect these points from here in Brooklyn to there in Bronx, and then uplift it in a way that was meaningful and had DOEs then within that couple of months, go ahead and get a contract and vendor out for halal food for our kids, which is phenomenal. This doesn't happen in this scale ever. In the city. It only took a pandemic, right, to talk about resiliency. That was a lot.
Oh, that was amazing. And it's not just resiliency, it's capacity building, right? So that's the other theme about with this discussion that we wanted to highlight is like, what does that mean to you with capacity building? I feel like with Manyak, with looking at the services that your organization offers, like, it's incredible that you've created this structure that identifies, the sort of like how the system fails a patient, right? So when I looked at your organization and I see that like there's a social service case manager along with a clinical companion and a health advocate. Like it's so interesting to me that you're coming up with these solutions that are structural within your organization and responding to how the larger structure, right, of our government, our society is failing these patients. So what I'm curious about now, and how we've just discussed the pandemic, and how leadership or people in people electeds, people in government and high offices of government, how that impacted us, how that impacted so many communities so negatively. What I'm curious about is, I've told someone this recently. I was like, because of this pandemic, I have like both lost so much faith in humanity and gained so much faith in humanity, because I've seen so much awful stuff happen, but then also this response that is also like above and beyond and amazing. And so what I'm wondering is, how do you feel? Are you optimistic about seeing, the changes that have happened in your communities and this level of organizing and this scaled up level of organizing and really like responding to the needs of people who've been so vulnerable already, right? But like super vulnerable, incredibly more vulnerable because of this pandemic. Do you have optimism that this is going to, filter up or filter sideways? I don't know how you want to envision in your head, but do you have optimism that it's going to filter in such a way where, we're going to see reform or bigger than that, revolution or just changes in the government that are what you wanted there already, right? So do you see people who are more excited about voting and more tuned into races or into elections? Or do you see new organizations that are trying to keep up the momentum from this, from these community service, from this community outreach? They're trying to keep momentum or grow it into something more permanent. So that's my next question. I think that kind of is a good segue with what you both just talked about. Whoever wants to go first with that.
Should I go? I don't want to monopolize. I'll go if you don't mind, Manyak. Absolutely. Well, but then it has to be respected that the fact that this has happened despite all of the inequities, and this had happened despite all of the resources, and despite the status quo that these folks like. It's very important for you for that sentence that you just said, that like, there was just so hope for humanity, but then you were also so much devastated. The devastation was calculated, right? That it was gonna happen. That's what was gonna happen. The hopefulness comes out of resiliency. The hopefulness comes out of the fact that we're resourceful, and the fact that we were able to adapt. And so it absolutely, I think I'll talk to the Bangladeshi community in specific. During this whole pandemic, because we were also, we're all home and we were looking for information and and sort of ways to connect. Politics happened to be the way that a lot of our groups had done it within the Bangladeshi community, and not to say that they weren't politically engaged prior, but they were doing this in a renewed way, because at this point this really mattered to their livelihood, and it really translated to what was happening in their homes. And so like I know that specifically in my community we had mobilized around making sure Working Families Party was on the ballot, and this meant like we were educating these people, our community who had never heard of these other parties, what they meant and what that could translate into in going forward. And furthermore, like I'll go much more deeper in speaking to the the social justice movement that arose this year. I know, and this is no secret that in the Asian community and South Asian community, I'll speak to myself, there is a sense of anti-Blackness and sort of lack of solidarity to Black and Brown communities as we reside together, right? So this summer, being in the midst of it, we saw this outpouring of solidarity, this intentional need for understanding why this is happening and why and how we should come in solidarity, and really being able to do introspective analysis of why we are feeling this way, or why do we have anti-Blackness or anti-Latino complexities in our circles. And so there were robust conversations around that, and out of that came solidarity movements. I think more than ever, South Asian Americans are finding themselves, or like in Asian American AAPI community at large, are finding that their safety and their social justice is, excuse me, intricately intertwined with the liberation and with the sort of uplifting of the Black and Brown community in all their history, their richness and everything. We cannot have one way or the other. And this sort of came out of many different ways, and specifically in the educational world, with the topic of segregation and discriminatory admissions policies. And there, I was so glad that our community was finally being inquisitive about what these policies meant, not only for themselves, but for the community at large. And then finally, another point is the labor movement, labor organizing movement. I know Bangladeshi community has a large group of folks who are yellow taxi cab drivers who are also renters, right? So they had, so the renters abolish rent, and all of that whole movement had collaborated with the New York City Public Taxi Alliances to ask for rent relief, to ask for debt relief for medallion holders. All of these happened within a year on WhatsApps, right? And so this just shows how things could happen if proper conversation and space is allowed to do so. And I'm 100% sure, and this is given and this is proven by sort of the emergent candidacies in candidates like Shahana, like Momita in Queens, and then many other AAPI candidates who have come out of this to sort of be politically engaged. And then folks like us who are parents but are sort of standing up in educational world to advocate for their students in a more equitable educational system.
Thank you so much, Tazin.
I think Tazin put it beautifully. And I would probably just add that, the pandemic really laid out another form of organizing beyond what we see as traditional organizing, which is, through technology. I think previous to the pandemic, we were thinking about organizing in the form of holding a rally or holding a protest, which still happened. But in the AAPI community, something that I saw in particular was a transition into using platforms like WeChat to organize their neighbors to speak up on issues. And we also cannot forget that the pandemic happened during very historical moments, some, which Tazin had mentioned, but it also happened when we were in the midst of the 2020 census. I think that process really activated many of our community members to think about what it means to be involved in activism and civic engagement, although it is essentially not a rare protest, but it is a social movement towards representation, towards equitable representation. And stemming from that and the Black and Asian solidarity movement, I think our community has really started to bond and think about what it is that drives progress, and that it is not it's not isolation. It is this concept of being together, of standing up together as a collective. And when anti-Asian hate crimes began, a lot of people in the AAPI community began to see the value of activism many of them for the very first time. I would just say, that many immigrants, especially AAPI immigrants, have this conception that if they get involved, if they meddle in a policy, they would get themselves and their families in trouble. I think a lot of this type of mentality draws from their experience in their home countries, where some community members have been persecuted for their political opinions. And they see this in the news every single day. So many of them don't want to get involved. My mother tells me, you should not be involved in all this organizing. I don't, if you're involved in the streets, that could put you in danger. And I think that's the fear that that's a lot of that's the mentality and the fear that a lot of people bring into this organizing space. But I think the pandemic and the events that have happened during the pandemic have really been able to open those doors for more members of our immigrant communities to stand up and stand in solidarity with one another, and to really be able to see that the value in solidarity, especially with members of the Black Lives Matter movement, and really thinking back to the historical roots of Asian Black solidarity, right? Back to 1955 with the Bandung Conference, back to thinking about how the civil rights movement really laid the framework for liberation for many of the people of color that reside here in the United States. So I think we have created a foundation right now for a very different type of organizing, and that's only going to continue.
That's wonderful.
Can I add really quickly one thing? I love that that last bit about the new sort of organizing, and and really legitimizing ethnic organizing, and the power of say, for example, for the sake of this conversation, the AAPI is organizing. And the fact that we were able to have our organizing being informed by the histories of the Black and Brown organizing in United States, but then also we all pulled ideas and sort of broad inspiration from organizing that happened globally in geopolitical spaces, right? Because we are in the American political landscape, we are the perpetual immigrant, basically. And so we do relish our position here in America, but then we also have this tie to our motherlands. And then we pull a lot of organizing informations and tactics from there, right? So the labor movement, say in South Asia, and so the movement in Hong Kong informed and showed us how to really do this in a way that is, that really gave us inspiration, and they really gave us solidifying ideas, and which really beautifully happened to be in lockstep with the organizing that was already happening on the ground in the Black and brown communities. And I think this is what made it sustainable, and this is what's going to make us sustainable going forward.
Thank you so much for adding that, Tazin. And I'll just say that, we're holding this discussion totally, of course, as a starting point. I would love to meet, I would love to follow up with an idea for more solidarity building, like in Southern Brooklyn. Any ideas that you have for that, or if you're open to hearing ideas from us, I would love to keep that conversation going. And also I want to just very quickly welcome Judge Montalbano, who's joined. I don't know if you can hear me, but I just want to say hi.
I can hear you. I had a problem with my computer, so I turned on another computer, and now my camera's not working, but I'm here.
Well, Judge Montalbano is a candidate, and so you spoke at a previous meeting, so just want to acknowledge you here. But yeah, I would like to open the floor to questions from anyone else. If you have any questions about anything that's been brought up so far, or just general ideas. Because I personally, the other thing I want to say is just like I have mixed feelings about having a month to celebrate a heritage. I think on the one hand it's great because it creates programming, right? It does raise awareness, but on the other hand it's always like, oh wait, we just get a month. So yeah, it's 8:18 and we're trying to end this by 8:30. So if Tazin or if Manya, if you want to add anything else too, please feel free to use this space to share anything. If you have even events going on, or if you want to fundraise, I don't know what other initiatives you're involved in, but please feel free to use this space to promote your work, promote your campaigns. And Peter Finnan just said, I want to say thank you. This has been a great discussion. I haven't been able to keep following up with the chat. Bobby Sackman just said, May is also Older Americans Month. And yes, we all deserve more than a month. It's also Celiac Awareness Month. There's actually a lot going on in May, but
quickly to the month issue. I mean, like in education world, that has been the pet peeve of all folks who are getting a month for some reason or another, right? So culturally responsive education is the way to address all of this tokenizing sort of days that we get, or these approaches that we get, or the surface level engagement that we get, right? So what is to say that the contribution of our people should be just confined to a few days, and how could we even do that? For example, the AAPI community is vast and so nuanced and so intergenerational, and it has history not only within this country but outside. It's a global phenomenon. So how can we just sort of limit that? And then how could we subject our children who has to have a global perspective as they're growing up to this limited point of view, that if they happen to be an AAPI student, that they only get 1 month of the year to look at themselves and really feel good about it, and then really not hear anything about it. And another thing about being culturally responsive in education and in pedagogy is to have representation in classroom. I think Yuck spoke about this a little bit, but hiring and then staffing our schools with teachers who look like us and who know of our experiences. So not just we could we could have representation for the sake of just representation, filling up the paper, but we have to be able to give them space to represent them in our experiences. And then our books and our textbooks, the things that our children are reading, if a story about AAPI are not being written by AAPI author, it's not okay with us. We need it to be written by us for our children, for it to count really. And then sort of, and to make our schools welcoming, not just to our children, but to our families who are a great asset. We come with wealth of knowledge, we come with wealth of history and wisdom, and it doesn't make sense for us to be just held back at the school's doors or educational footsteps, but not ever allowed within our the system for us to contribute years and decades and millennia of wisdom that we have to bring here. And only in that way can we really develop children that are meant to transform this world going forward. So y'all, y'all, when you have the chance in any educational space, please do advocate for CRSE, that's culturally responsive education, representation, integration, youth empowerment, family engagement. These are the things that you should advocate for if you ever get the chance. And that is my campaign at this point. No, Baruch, I'm not running for anything, ever.
I'm going to watch the recording of this, and I'm going to make sure I have everything you just said written down so that we can make sure that we put that more in our social media and we blast that more. I'm just going to read questions that came in through the chat. I don't think anyone's hands raised right now. Okay. So let's see. Matt, I believe, please someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Matt is the next question. What were the elements of advocacy from Southern Asia that helped? And how do they differ from what is traditionally done in the US? I mean, I feel like you answered some of that, Tazin, but if you want to speak more on that.
Really quickly, I think one thing that folks think of us when they see somebody like me coming down from South Asia is that I probably am not in the forefront of advocacy or, or political protesting or anything of that sort. In fact, in Bangladesh is probably still the only country that went into war for their right to speak the language that they speak. So very, very aligned with my sort of way of advocating at this point. But then also that movement was led by women largely. So if you were to ever Google, Bangladesh Liberation War, you would see that there's women up in the front of, not only protesting, but also fighting. And then they were also part of feminizing the workforce afterwards. Very historically, when Bangladesh were just first liberated, British thinkers had thought that Bangladeshi labor force could never modernize because they will never allow, they will have half of its workforce always at home. But to their surprise, these Muslim, these South Asian rural women really came into the labor force in a way that it is now one of the fastest growing GDP holding country in the world. And I think we bring that sort of veracity when we come to our labor organizing, when we bring what we bring to our political organizing, and of course our education, because we really did fight for that country, for that language too, and we're gonna defend it to the T.
That's so amazing. I can't wait to look more into that. I didn't realize that. Peter asks, what is the best way to advocate for language access in healthcare and city programs? I'll leave that question to you, Monya. What is the best way to advocate for language access in healthcare and city programs?
I think it's important to make sure that you're reaching out to your elected officials around this type of advocacy. Our local council members at Carlos Menchaca has actually been very supportive of language access in the healthcare space. And it's also important to make sure that you are bringing this up to leadership in health and hospitals and at DOHMH. Many community-based organizations do have those connections to them. And we, for example, have held several press conferences to specifically speak with these officials around what we're observing, around the vaccine racism, around the healthcare racism that we see every single day. So I think making sure that you're elevating those voices and also collecting stories from community members that are struggling with this, in the same way that we were doing for the New York Health Act, and presenting these realities to your representatives is the way to change narrative. And we are making slow but progressive changes in the way that language access is being represented in the city. On a more local level at the vaccination hubs, I know that currently they have changed signage to make sure that things are being presented in multiple languages. I also know that on a citywide level, they're also expanding the number of languages that the city must translate their documents in. So this type of advocacy is important. It's important to be there, to be present, to provide testimonials, but to also connect with your local elected officials to make sure that those voices are being heard.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great answer. Tazin also adds in the chat, also support legislation looking for disaggregation of Asian Americans' data, health, education, political, in every section. Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense. We're not a monolith. Okay, so wow, we're actually pretty much on time. I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going through the people who are here. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. This was great and just a wonderful thing to do on a Thursday evening. I'm honored that I got to speak to you both in this setting. And thank you so much to South Central Brooklyn United for Progress for creating this space and supporting this event. I feel like we can unmute ourselves if anyone wants to say any goodbyes and thank you.
I was just going to say, if anybody wants to hear more from Tazin, there is a CEC 22 meeting on Tuesday, May 1st.
That's Jess's.
May 1st? Wait, May?
June.
I'm sorry, June 1st.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's COVID. I don't know, right?
I have no idea. I'm going to put the Zoom link in the chat right now. Tazin does Tazin does chair the Equity Committee as well on the CEC, and we have a lot to discuss, even though it's our final meeting of the term. But it's all business. We're not backing down. It's not going to be a party.
We're not having an end of session party.
I mean, if somebody brings a baby for us to ogle, I guess we could do that for a minute. But no, we have some serious stuff to discuss.
Y'all support the educational, fully funding educational budget portion of it, please. We can't keep, let the ball drop at this juncture.
Yeah. 100.
And I just want to make a shameless plug. We are also at AMPS, we're also trying to fundraise to hire a Chinese speaking therapist for AAPI Heritage Month to bring free mental health services into South Brooklyn. So I will drop the campaign link here. If anybody would be willing to share with your friends and family, would definitely be appreciated. If you'd like to contribute, I would certainly appreciate that as well. So thank you.
Yes, and we're happy to share this in in our Facebook discussion group, our Facebook page, our social. That's amazing. Okay, well, have a good night, everyone. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Rosa.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone. It's really great.
Thank you.